Our next speaker, David Moore, supports individuals and organisations to change adaptively and communicate constructively. He works as a facilitator, an academic, a writer and a system designer. David is the current president of the Victorian Association for Restorative Justice, and he's recently been a consultant to the Defence Abuse Response Task Force and is currently a principal consultant to the National Redress Scheme. Would you please welcome David Moore?
Thanks, Damien, and thanks, Auntie Lois and Nick. Good afternoon, everyone, and I also begin by paying my respects to the traditional owners of the land we're meeting on this afternoon. Look, I'll speak briefly, and then I think it's probably best if we get to the panel discussions. So I thought what might be a useful way to frame what we've just heard from both of the previous speakers is what Nick was talking about, work in the Territory and Western Australia involving improvements to frontline policing, adjustments to the court and the way in which communities attempted to resolve disputes and conflict. Including those vexed and high-profile issues where traditional systems of symbolic reparation through payback were there were some attempts to combine that with the colonial court system, and then legal changes made subsequently. So these are difficult issues, and there's a lot of experimentation going on. And as Nick rightly said, a lot of the experimentation includes comparing what's happening in Australia with what's happening in Aotearoa, New Zealand, and what's happening in Canada. And I think, as Auntie Lois pointed out, obviously what those countries have in common is a history of dispossession, colonial systems imposed on Indigenous systems, but also now an opportunity to look at what's worked in terms of the impact of the sort of dignified activism that Lois was talking about, and also programs that we have actually seen to be successful across those countries, and a couple of other places we don't typically think of as comparable, such as northern Scandinavia, where the Sami people actually look to a lot of what is happening in Indigenous justice in our part of the world. So very briefly, I got involved in this field about 25 years ago, actually around the time of the Royal Commission into Aboriginal Deaths in Custody, because I was in charge of the Justice Studies program at Charles Sturt University, and I just happened to be in the right place at the right time when a proposal was put forward to build on what our friends in New Zealand had come up with by way of the now famous 1989 legislation, the Children, Young Person and Their Families Act, which essentially introduced a group decision-making process in child protection and youth justice into the New Zealand national system, essentially because two pilot programs run by Maori activists had been so successful that quite sensibly the national government said, well, if it's that successful, why don't we offer it to everybody? Now, New Zealand being different, with 20% of the population being Maori and Pacific Islander, that was a radical but sensible reform, which then other countries have been able to take the lead from. Where we were in southern New South Wales, a group of us took the suggestion, said we don't have to legislate, we can run these group processes in the legal space where police currently provide cautioning, much as Nick was describing happening with some thoughtful police sergeants in the Territory. And in retrospect, what we got very much right at the time was focusing not just on the overarching principles of restoration, or even the program, this happened to be run in a police program, but more importantly on the actual process, what goes on in the room. And I think that's a useful way of thinking about what's happened over the last 25 years, because in effect we've had two parallel reform movements, if you like. One being the Indigenous-focused courts, so adjustments to the court system to try, if you like, to begin in some small way to make up for the history that Auntie Lois was summarising. And in parallel, we've had the development of this group conferencing process, which we were originally just using as part of our diversion program for young people, and which, as it's been applied and modified more and more broadly, is coming to be understood for what it really is, and that is a mechanism for introducing deliberative democracy into decision-making. So the group conferencing process which we originally used in Australia just for youth justice and just for diversion in programs that were legislated starting in the mid-1990s, South Australia, then New South Wales and the like, and eventually the whole of the country, with Victoria being one of the last places to legislate in 2005. That process is now being far more widely used. But in parallel, and many people in this room will know this, the system of Koori courts, Murray courts, Noongar courts has developed starting in South Australia, and in fact originally strongly supported by a magistrate who'd worked in PNG in the late 60s and early 70s and had seen what could and shouldn't be done with a colonial system imposed on Indigenous justice systems. So there was a rapid expansion in parallel but largely separately of group conferencing programs, initially just used in youth justice and initially mainly for diversion through the 1990s and early 2000s. And then from the late 1990s and through the early 2000s and continuing up to the present, we've had these systems of Noongar, Murray, Koori courts. So again, in the Victorian context, many people here in this room, in fact some of you may have been involved directly with these, will know about the Broadmeadows and the Shepparton and the Latrobe Valley and more recently the Mildura Koori Court. And the focus in those programs has been on, in a sense, introducing a degree of respect, directly involving community elders, slightly changing the layout of the court, changing the look of the court, the physical space of the court. And all those things are useful and important and helpful. What I think is really interesting now is in parallel, these programs involving group conferencing, which are expanding well beyond youth justice, were appreciated in an Indigenous setting, ironically, not so much in New Zealand and Australia, but overseas. So a group of us were asked in the late 1990s to go to Canada, and we literally worked from BC right across to Newfoundland and Labrador, working specifically with members of the Aboriginal Justice Learning Network, training people in group conferencing. Because their argument was, well, this is culturally appropriate. We've been sitting in circles for a very long time, as in roughly 15,000 years, sorting out issues in a sweat lodge. This allows us to introduce this into the mainstream justice system and get away with it, where we're actually involved directly in decision making. Now that group conferencing process, of course, it was criticised in Australia as being not appropriate for this group or that group. The very first one we had in Wagga Wagga was, this won't work for Wiradjuri people. So I said, well, you go and tell that to the Land Council, they like it. So this was people coming down from Sydney wanting to shut something down because it was democratic. But what we've since done is work out that these group conferencing processes are not primarily about victims meeting offenders. It's about a group of people in conflict being given the opportunity, exactly as Nick was describing, to be brought together with their extended networks of relatives and with professionals who might help them, and work through issues to the point where we can leave the room with an agreement that's actually realistic, sustainable, takes into account everybody's conditions, and is something we couldn't have crafted on our own, and certainly wouldn't accept if it were imposed on us by a magistrate or a protection worker or whoever else. So that process in recent years has been, it's been recommended, as again many people in this room would know, by the Victorian Royal Commission into Family Violence, ironically because it was trialled successfully and extensively in Canada, where they used our training manual in programs run originally in the 1990s. It's been available to adult courts in Victoria under the 2010 adjustments to the Sentencing Act. It's just that no magistrates have been using it because the only programs that have been funded in Victoria to use this group conferencing program are indeed the children's court programs. So it's perfectly legal, it's just there are no programs, or there have been no programs. However, the problem-solving courts, so these are not only the Koori courts, but also the drug courts and also courts with a dedicated family violence list, are now saying, well, why is it we only have this supported judicial decision-making for the children's court when it's been tested with randomised controlled trials and consistently found to reduce reoffending, give us participant satisfaction rates that we don't see anywhere else in the system, And also it turns out to particularly reduce reoffending in serious cases, particularly cases involving violence. Why are we not using this? What's heartening is that a lot of magistrates are aware of this, and there's now an open discussion not about should we do it, but how do we do it. So essentially we're moving to more democratic engagement, which is, I think, what was partly hoped for with the initiatives to create Koori courts, but what for a long time was not adequately understood was how much skill involved and how many techniques needed to be brought to bear by a convener to make this happen. And that's really what Auntie Lois is talking about in the magnificent work they've done at Warrawa, which is to say we have principles of, and I won't repeat them, you said them much better than I did, but that series of principles starting with R, including respect, and they're high expectations, but where the students are actually taught a skill set around relationship management. So that when they, after their years at the school, when they go back to their communities, they take with them not only the curriculum content, but a tangible set of powerful skills in relationship management that actually help us resolve disputes in our community, get decisions made at a collective level, and so make it easier for us to live and work and study together. And so we're going beyond just the aspiration to the understanding that there's a learnable, teachable skill set. And it's in terms of justice system, formal justice system applications, we're moving beyond that simply being a mechanism for diverting people from the court to something we're actually using in courts, and also that's a process that's being made available post-sentence, so that it's all very well to give people a sentence, but we haven't in any way restored right relations among all the people who've been affected by a crime. And until that's done, problems fester or get worse. And again, the examples Nick was giving from the Territory in the West show how you can do that well and how you can do it not so well. And ideally, we're trying to move to a situation where these approaches are understood as a system, so that when a good person, a good committed professionals move on, the system doesn't collapse. That we have this general approach embedded in how we work. And so, just as a wrap-up, and I think this is consistent with the sort of work you see at a school like Warrawa, the idea is when harm is done, firstly, we don't want to do any further harm, so do no further harm. And then, rather than doing things to or for people, provide a process so people can work with each other to try and sort things out. And the third and final fundamental principle is let us try to restore right relations. So as far as possible, resolve the disputes that are amongst us, and as far as possible, work out what's still causing conflict. And as far as possible, address and transform that conflict into cooperation, which is where I think the common theme running through all the effective programs we've just heard described is that there's a principle of restoring right relations, and increasingly we're aware of how to actually do it and how we can systematise that. Thank you.